In her book, Time to Think, Nancy Klein shares the following useful perspective. We think we listen, but we don't. We interrupt one another, we finish each other's sentences, and we fill in the pauses with our own stories. Our guest today is a passionate Time to Think practitioner, and we're going to be delving into the art of meaningful conversation, learning how to grow deeper connections with one another and ourselves. I am proud to be hosting Soshin Subramanian. Soshin, welcome to Echoes of Eternity.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. This episode has been, I think, in the pipeline, I want to say, for some time. Like we spoke, probably a month ago, planning this. I'm pretty excited to learn from you and get your insights into a thinking environment and the principles behind it. I just want to say that based on the environments we spend most of our time in, I'd like to think that we pretty easily fall into patterns of conditioned engagement. And I'm hoping by having this conversation with you, we can almost shift perspectives, or at the very least, highlight the better way of creating engagement. So quite excited. This is hopefully a part one of two, where we'll be chatting about the principles of a thinking environment. Before we even get into the principles, right? You are an actuary, you're currently lecturing at the University of Johannesburg, but you've also spent a considerable number of years in corporate, in the insurance industry. Do you want to maybe share, what engagements particularly were like before you even knew about, time to think and those principles? I don't even know if you can recall, but if you can share, what that was like, how you then came to find time to think and those teachings.
Sure. Thank you. What a nice question. It's actually so interesting to look back at my journey. So I first came across Time to Think in a leadership workshop. It's actually a 3-week-long leadership workshop that ran, throughout the year. And before that, I don't think I was quite aware of the impact I had on other people, So I would actually say that before I started studying this work, I wasn't actually somebody who made the most of team meetings. In fact, I can confidently say I avoided team meetings. Even as a team manager, I didn't recognize the importance of when we commune, those places can be places of generation and ideation. And so I suppose my entire template of what good education looks like, what good thinking looks like, was never, I would say, never kind of fully grounded in this idea that the way we behave can impact the thinking of another person. So for me, that was quite a profound shift. But your question made me think about some lights, bright spots of engagement. And one of the ideas that came to mind now is that my first manager ever, so as a fresh graduate, I had this amazing manager. Her name is Anusha Mittal. At the time, she was Anusha Duki. She would always, whenever I went to her with a problem, she would always ask me, Soshin, what do you think? And ask it in such a way that she was genuinely interested. And I remember how at the time that was actually a shock to my system. To have somebody genuinely asking, what do you think? And then being genuinely interested, which now that I think about it, it's bizarre that for me that would have been a shock. That is, it's a sign that is not commonplace, at least in my journey. So yeah, I think that's my reflection on kind of before 2013.
Yeah. No, I think that's interesting. I mean, thanks for sharing that. And I actually want to touch on just that little bit that you mentioned when you were fresh grad, just fresh into the corporate space, and your manager asks you, what do you think? If I have to think about my own experience, and maybe this is again comes back to personality and confidence at that time, I'd be terrified. I'd want to attend the meeting, but please don't ask me what I think, right? But again, it's different for everyone. Some people want that opportunity to speak and to be heard. And some of us just want to sit in the corner, afraid to share our opinions and give our input. Maybe just highlight or, briefly explain to us before we delve into the principles for people that don't know what a time to think environment is. What is it and why is it powerful? I think you've touched on, some of it already, but let's break it down for someone that's coming across this for the first time. What is a time to think environment? Why is it so powerful?
Great. So the finding that Nancy Kline in her work, she's the pioneer of this work. Her finding was that when she kind of looked at people's ability to think well for themselves, so we could call this independent thinking, the ability for somebody to think with their full self, without kind of limitation or without the need to please somebody else. So thinking genuinely of the type that I want to be doing, about the things that I want to be thinking, and in a way that is uninhibited or uninfluenced by what you want me to think or what you want me to say. So that's what with referring to when we call this thing kind of unencumbered or independent thinking. And so she found that what mattered most that affects people's ability to do this kind of beautiful, brave, courageous thinking was not something innate about them as a person, but actually how they were being treated by the people that they were with while they're thinking. So that's quite a powerful finding for me, which is what I alluded to before I encountered that leadership course and after. This idea that the way I am with somebody influences their level and their quality of thinking, and therefore their intelligence, therefore their capacity to think, to live into their fullest ability to think for themselves. So that's the big thing about what we call a thinking environment. So to create a thinking environment, we ask the question, how can we treat people in such a way that they feel brave and empowered to do their best thinking? Yeah.
I think that's like amazing. There's so many little light bulbs in my mind that's just like gone off. And as a starting point, right, what I think you're saying is it's all about the approach. And this doesn't just apply to corporate, right? In the corporate space, I think if you just think of social engagements as well, and it's just the general approach that we take is sometimes not the best way, because we very much concerned about ourselves, but we forget the way we behave and engage can influence the way the rest of the group or the other person engages, re-engages as well. So let's maybe get into the principles, because I think we'll unpack a lot of what you've also shared already just by discussing the principles. So the first one I want to chat about is giving attention or paying attention. And we live in this world, right, where if you just take social media as an example and you open up any of the platforms, you are flooded with content, right? Everybody is fighting for your attention. In your experience, what is the best way we can kind of give our attention to someone else that's sharing, contributing, without interrupting their thoughts? Okay, because I feel like it's a very common stumbling block, because we are also eager to share our own thoughts that it's sometimes difficult to give the other person a fair chance to get through their thought process and share that with us.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's very foundational to all of this work. So I think the important thing to understand is, like, what is attention in the first place, right? So As you say, nowadays we understand that there's this concept of continuous partial attention, right? So we're bombarded with different things. So if you think about even just the way you're managing your own time, right? Like the car that you're in is bombarding you with different kind of response requiring things, right? Your computer is probably pinging you at different things. So one way that I have found is actually to start paying attention to what attention you're giving yourself as a starting point, right? So even just, for example, switching off that notification that there's an email, or switching off that WhatsApp notification that there's a WhatsApp message. I think that there's so much to be said of what those little pings are actually doing to our brains, right? So kind of starting at that level, we could ask ourselves, what is the level of attention that we deserve from ourselves? And that might give us a sense of, well, what kind of attention do we want to give to another person, right? So in the thinking environment work, we define attention as this type of listening that is so respectful in its quality that it goes beyond just listening to not interrupt somebody or listening to understand somebody, but it actually becomes this kind of force, if you like, that helps somebody generate their thinking. So we can learn to listen in ways that moves beyond just listening to understand, but actually listening to what we say, listening to ignite thinking or listening to generate thinking. And one of the best ways to do this is to be genuinely interested. In other words, be asking, how far can this beautiful, capable mind in front of me, how far can they go before they need my own thinking? And the way Nancy says it is, and after that, we ask, how much further? And even after that, how much further will they go before they need my intervention? Yeah.
That's so profound. I honestly, I knew this was going to be like one of those episodes that would blow my mind. But I'm genuinely I'm impressed, because it sounds like something simple, right? Like these principles, when I was going through them, it's not something new, but I think it's been forgotten almost, and the way we practice it has been lost. And I love that you mentioned at the beginning of your answer, your response was about setting boundaries, right, for yourself. If you can't set those boundaries for yourself in terms of what do you give your attention to, how can you expect to do the same for someone else? And the second point about asking yourself the question, and I want to raise this because I never did this before, but I'm going to start doing it, is asking myself the question, how far can this mind go before I need to intervene? That for me is it's so beautiful and something I never thought about before. Just in terms of, before we step into the second sort of principle, so this paying attention, or, giving attention and genuine attention. And like you said, it's a pretty foundational principle. What is the one piece of advice you would give to someone if they just, let's say they didn't, or they can't absorb everything we're going to speak about today, just this one principle, and they want to put it into practice? Because for me, it's a very, very common stumbling block, right? Before, one of my friends told me about you and this work that you do, I would constantly interrupt the other person because I was so eager to give my input. And then she told me about this, I met Soshin and he was telling me about interrupting people's thoughts. You should practice slowing down and maybe not interrupting. So my question is, what is the one sort of practical piece of advice you could maybe share with some of us, or actually all of us, in terms of avoiding the trap of interrupting someone's thoughts?
So I think my answer will be based on the title of Nancy's latest book. So the book is called The Promise That Changes Everything. I Won't Interrupt You. Okay. And the reason I'm choosing that as the answer is that there's something about that promise that is full of potential. So if we can somehow make that promise that I won't interrupt your words or your thoughts. So now, kind of unpacking that promise a little bit is that we think the brain thinks in these waves and pauses, right? So if you can imagine that the end of one wave is actually this full pregnant silence that is giving birth to a new wave. And what tends to happen in a rushed world full of urgency and distraction is in that moment of silence, we might make the assumption that this is the best time to come in with some new thought. We might make the assumption that the person is stuck, or that they don't have the ability to generate the next word, or that the word that they forgot is better filled by us completing their sentence, right? But if we recognize that their moments of silence are places where they are generating new waves, then we ask ourselves the question, okay, so what am I sacrificing here by coming in and breaking that wave and actually kind of killing that next generation of the idea? So one question that has been so powerful for me that I learned through people like Nancy Kline is we could actually investigate what's the assumption that's driving that interruption. It might be something like, what I'm about to say next is more important than what the person is about to think next. And if we kind of go into that assumption, why would we be assuming? So why would we be assuming that? It would be something good to look at. So I think my answer that I would pose as an initial attempt would be recognizing that if we knew that this moment of silence, this moment of like the next wave being born, right, was full of potential. If we knew that, how would we be as a person who is interested in generating the best thinking in the room? How would we be in that moment if we knew that there's something beautiful about to be born?
That's so fascinating. It's just, yeah, I'm actually lost for words. And again, there's a follow-up question, right? Because on what you've shared, talking about this moment just before the birth of this idea, thought that's coming. And I'm going to ask it because I myself am curious, and maybe others out there as well have had this thought now, just as you've shared. How do you then know when is the right time to come in? Because I feel like, you might not know when the person is done then, right? You've maybe spoken about something, but you're pausing because you yourself are searching for the right words, or, you're letting some idea brew before you share that. And the other person might think, okay, this person is done, I can come in now. So how do you actually know when is the right moment to then come in?
Well, we're actually doing it now with each other, right? Yeah. So we've kind of, with this awareness and because of the topic, we're speaking in a way where there's a bit of a change in our body, in our level of regulation, because we kind of feeling like, we could start to trust this assumption that, or this promise actually, that I'm not going to get interrupted, right? So we're kind of moving from this place of I'm getting lucky not to be interrupted to actually, it's starting to become a bit of a belief for me that in this conversation, I'm not going to get interrupted. That's changing my brain, right? And with the change in the brain, we will start to actually be bolder and even more eloquent in the way we express ourselves. So we start to feel a bit freer in the searching, And we also start to feel a bit freer in the asking, I think, of what we need, right? So in this kind of increased level of freedom and increased level of trust, there starts to be a bit of a kind of unspoken agreement that actually I'm not going to interrupt your thoughts, so you don't have to rush it. And because of that, there starts to be this almost like a knowing, right? So I will either ask for your input if it's a formal contracted space, but if it's an everyday conversation, then it becomes a bit harder because then the boundary is not as firm. But even in that kind of, let's say, boundaryless environment, we start to learn that there'll be a place where I can stop, and because of the silence in a way that we build in, we start to create that certainty that, okay, I'm not kind of tramping on somebody's next thought. So one very effective way to do it is to actually slow down the conversation. And yeah, I think that's, you learn, there's a bit of a knowing, I would say. Once there's that agreement, you kind of start to pick up. And maybe one very useful tip is to say, well, what if I just waited just another second or two to see if there was something else being generated? I don't lose anything. In fact, I probably gain many, many, many minutes by even just taking that second or two, even just for myself.
No, I think that's really important, and I'm glad you've highlighted that. And again, it speaks to so much like to awareness as well. And I think it takes time to practice this, especially because we're so conditioned to. I feel like doing the exact opposite, right? But let's maybe take the conversation to the next principle, so that I don't start stepping on the toes of each of these principles just by talking about the first one. So the second one is, equality, right? And I want to tackle this from an introvert's perspective, but please feel free to share it, like your perspective from a more holistic approach. But everybody wants to be seen, right? Everybody wants to be heard, given the opportunity to speak. But from an introvert's perspective, if I have to quickly give an example, and think of a meeting room, boardroom, an introvert generally, and I'm going to use myself as an example, would be afraid. And you mentioned courage and being bold. It's not very easy to do, right? In a room potentially full of extroverts or people that are much louder, much bolder, much more courageous. How do we actually go about practically creating equality during a conversation? So giving everyone that opportunity to be seen, to be heard.
Yeah, that's a powerful idea and question. Firstly, I should start by saying I'm not quite sure that the more outspoken people are necessarily being bolder and more courageous in that meeting. So if we had to flip it around, what might be the most bold, the most courageous act of, say, the leader of the meeting, the chair of the meeting, would actually be, what can I do to make sure I get the best thinking of everyone in the room? And one of the things might be that, well, I want everybody to feel that their voice matters equally in this room. So this component of equality, and maybe if I could just take a one step back, is that when we were asking these questions of how can we treat people in such a way that they can think for themselves, think well for themselves, it turns out that there are these 10 kind of behaviors, 10 ways of being in the world, or a way of being in the world that encompasses these 10 types of behaviors that turn out to be consistently good in terms of yielding these results that facilitate independent thinking. So that's these components that we're talking about, and this kind of second principle that you mentioned is equality. So in a thinking environment, when we say equality, we mean this idea that even if there's a hierarchy, even if I'm not the decision maker, we each have equal capacity to think for ourselves about our own lives, about our own approach to a situation. And so a leader who is equipped with that knowledge that equality sends this message that each person matters here, that each voice is equal because each person's capacity to think for themselves is equal, then you even your structure of your meeting would change, right? Because the person who's then aware that there are a few voices dominating the room would immediately start to recognize that this room is no longer a thinking environment. This meeting is one of domination. This meeting is one of inequality. This meeting is maybe one of kind of maybe even suppression of a voice. And so there are things that we could do to bring all the voices in the room. And that requires setting boundaries in place, right? So for example, simply going around the room and giving everybody a turn to answer a certain question, doing that in a systematic way, is already an ease-creating thing for the introvert who might be worried about, am I going to step on somebody else's toes by speaking right now? Is everybody else finished? Is this quiet spot a spot where I can come in? So this awareness that equal airtime or equal talk time is symbolic of the level of equality that we believe is this powerful thing about, when we talk about equality. Yeah.
No, I think it's so cool actually. Like, I hope people are taking notes, because I know I've sat in meetings and like you're saying, it can turn from a meeting of equality to one of domination. And I want to, so I mean, this is very easy for people who are in a corporate setting to maybe, grasp these concepts and relate to them. If I have to think about a social setting as well, because we've all been, I'd like to think, in at least both settings at one point or another, the formal setting, if you want to call it that, and the more informal social setting. But even in that setting, I want to say, because you are immediately more comfortable with your group of friends, or people that you're just generally more comfortable with. If I have to just think about that setting for a second, and if we're having a conversation, the number of ideas that could be generated in that setting, it could be limitless if we knew how to create the right environment and space for everyone. Because even in that setting, it's very easy to be isolated sometimes and feel like, my input is not going to matter as much. And the same goes back to the boardroom setting. Cool, the chair of the meeting has given me this opportunity to speak, but what I'm about to say might not matter enough for me to even share, right? Because I think it's easy to also feel that way, especially if you think about, a graduate. You might feel this way, that I'm going to say the wrong thing as well. So as much as it's important to create the equality, because I fully believe that it's a very important, principle to kind of put in place, at the same time, it can feel like pressure for certain people. But again, it maybe, and I'd like to get your thoughts, right? Maybe it comes back to just the general environment and the boundaries that are set. But yeah, just your thoughts on that. Like, when does it become a point of pressure as opposed to an opportunity to meaningfully contribute?
And can I just clarify, you mean the pressure that comes from, let's say, the introvert or the person who's trying to bring out the views of everybody?
So I think it could be both, right? Something I never thought about, but it could genuinely be both.
Yes. And I think people will feel, if it's this contrived sense of equality versus an environment where my views are genuinely valued. So it's the level of genuineness, I think, that will make a difference in the feeling of how welcomed am I here, how welcomed am I thoughts and my mistakes and my thought process in articulating myself, right? So you find that, yeah, I think if we just look at, let's say, a family setting, right, there will almost, I think I certainly have it in my family, there would be voices that would dominate the table, right, the dinner table. And I think just the sense of, like, again, coming back to this awareness that if we could measure, let's say we take a long-term average of the proportion of time each person takes, or the proportion of time each person has to do uninterrupted thinking and speaking, you probably find that, the quieter ones are the ones who are in service of the thinking of others and not benefiting from an environment that is in service of their best thinking. So I think it's this awareness that will create the actions kind of will speak louder than the words that say you're equal here. You could have a chair of a meeting or a friend saying, I really want to hear what you think, but then if they never quite give you the chance, the person who's waiting there saying, okay, well, is this the spot? Yeah,
Everything you're saying is just so profound. So yeah, no, thanks for that. And I think it actually leads on really nicely to the next principle, which is giving genuine acknowledgement, almost, right, after someone has maybe shared something, as opposed to just saying, oh, thanks, for sharing, and then moving on. I think it's also something that happens too often. So let's say now we've created this environment of equality. We're giving the people time to think and to share. And then once they've said what they've had to, it's like, thanks, and we move on to the next person. So I think that's also something that can potentially happen where there isn't a genuine implementation of these principles. It's like, I need to create these principles so everyone feels welcome and whatever, but I don't really care. It's just, and it's happened to me. Like, I was presenting in a meeting the one time, and everyone kind of switched off in that moment because of where I was on the ladder, if you want to call it that. And I actually rushed through the presentation. I purposely skipped certain things because I knew nobody was listening. So I think, although the principle is about giving genuine acknowledgement, how do we then be more genuine in implementing these principles? And of course, giving genuine acknowledgement when someone does share, whether, what they've shared is correct or incorrect, to the conversation.
Yeah, great. So this idea of, we're now kind of talking about this component of appreciation, right? The finding here is that people think better in a context of genuine praise and acknowledgement, and appreciation. And appreciation doesn't necessarily have to mean I'm verbalizing something about you. So even just the way I ask you a question, even just the act of listening and being interested is sending their message that I appreciate your mind. I appreciate your thoughts. So there's so much that can be embodied in an interaction. Specifically, we know that kind of hearing appreciation and the act of being appreciated is changing. Like, it's essentially changing your body and your mind. So we know, for example, the level of blood flow to the brain is, to different parts of the body is changing. We know that the types of hormones that are being released in your body is changing in the context of appreciation. So there's this physiological type of response, in addition to this kind of known knowledge that, we know that if somebody says something nice about you, that you feel better. But it actually is quite profoundly, let's call it moving and kind of potential filling for the person to be in this context of appreciation. So that is the idea, is that appreciation, if done at a certain ratio, much higher, in terms of frequency than you're being criticized, then that is the thing that creates an environment that helps people to think well. So in a thinking environment, we try to define this as, well, let's try to create a ratio of 5 appreciation as to 1 criticism. Okay, so that it doesn't mean shying away or not kind of saying what's wrong or what issues are, calling things out, but it does mean that you're doing it in a way that is respectful and appreciative of all the good qualities that a person has. So if you think about that presenter, it's like we could ask the question, how can we appreciate this presenter? How can we appreciate the presenter in the way we ask them to, in the way we invite them to the session? How can we appreciate them in the way that we are listening and while they're delivering their presentation? How can we show that we value the work and the preparation that's been put in? How can we appreciate them post the presentation? So when we start to think about that spectrum of questions, then it can really be seen that we've got quite a job to do if we want to truly show appreciation. And as you say, it can be as simple as thank you for some quality that we admire in you or in the presentation that we were moved by, affected by. But I think it does go much deeper. So listening with respect is one of the ultimate kind of acts of appreciation that we can offer.
Now, I think, thank you for sharing those points. I think it's so important, and I know for me personally, it's going to change so much. So I want to express genuine gratitude right now for what you've shared, because it means so much personally as well. So thanks for sharing those points. And I think I'm sort of leapfrogging to the next principle, but I think it ties in really nicely with this idea of appreciation as well. So before we get to that, I just had a thought. We forget that so much of our communication is non-verbal, actually, right? So by you sitting there and giving me your attention is an act of appreciation. But if I had to think of a meeting room setting or whatever, and I'm presenting and you playing on your phone or your laptop, it's pretty disrespectful, actually. It's the complete opposite of showing appreciation, because, you signaling to me that my work doesn't, or this presentation doesn't matter in some sense. Even though you might be paying attention, people like to multitask, okay? Whatever that means. But in many ways, it's also just showing lack of appreciation. So we forget about the non-verbal signals that we're giving off in any setting, actually. Whether it's frowning or smiling, I think, there's lots of non-verbal communication signals that we forget. It doesn't always have to be words. So now jumping to this next principle, which is creating, an environment of ease almost. Now, this is something that genuinely fascinates me, because we're in a world where people want ideas now. There's a sense of urgency all the time. We have a meeting, and even in the meeting or whatever setting, it feels rushed. Okay, so we've spoken about giving each individual an opportunity to think, and then secondly to contribute. But I feel like it becomes so difficult when it's, you enter a space where it just feels rushed. I'm giving you your time to think, but think faster. Almost, right? That's the idea. It's think faster. Give me your idea and then let's move on. So we might even skip the whole principle of appreciation, because we just want everyone's ideas now, run with the best idea, done. Okay. I don't know, what is your thoughts on that principle of creating this environment of ease?
Yeah, it's so good that you put it that way. It's not only think faster, but think now, right? Even me just asking you a question and saying, you answer right now, putting you on the spot. You hit the nail on the head. It's kind of this opposite of urgency, right? But the scenario you painted about the laptop or the cell phone being kind of demanding your attention almost at the same time as you trying to give it to somebody else is an example of where ease is getting destroyed. So if we think about, one aspect of ease that we can think about is how at ease are we internally? So if you have a leader or a parent, anybody who's trying to encourage good thinking of other people, right? And they are not themselves at ease. That kind of level of, let's say, dysregulation, hyper kind of sensitivity. So it's almost like the sensitized response system, right? That the person who's with you is going to feel that as well. So if we think about what the phone does or what the laptop does in a conversation, is that it's actually saying to the other person that any minute now, whatever pops up on that screen, whether it's a little reminder of the weather or whether it's an actual message, whatever pops up is going to be more important to you than my thinking, right? And so you cannot create that promise. I can't actually make the promise that I won't interrupt if I know that I could be interrupted by this device. So it is a complete, break in that promise. And so that's something that's to be aware of, is that these are all the things that kind of destroy ease. Now, why is ease important? It is that when we create a sense of urgency or rush, we activate parts of our body that are designed to stop the functioning of our higher order kind of executive functioning and send resources and send activity to the flight or flight responses. So we actually sending our bodies into a state of adrenaline and cortisol kind of infused environments, as opposed to calmer, more regulating type, a more regulated version of ourselves. And so that is even just going down right to the biology of things, that is why urgency is going to destroy the quality of thinking. Urgency is going to create this emergency response. What do we need to do? It's kind of sending us into survival mode, not into the mode that says, what are the best outcomes for me, for my family, for my relationships, for humanity? What are the best outcomes that my thinking can produce? So a way to think about ease is kind of the opposite of that internal rush or urgency, and a way of being that is more creating, more generating. And so one of my teachers, Maurice Barrick, I loved the way she explained this to me. She says that quite often in the business world, you might find that people think that urgency creates energy. And her way of putting it stuck with me, and she says that ease creates a different type of energy, a more beautiful, more enabling, more generative energy than the urgency. So if we could kind of address that fallacy that people think urgency is energy creating, well, actually, let's create a type of energy that is much more useful in the world.
Let's go to the last principle that I want to chat about, because it follows, all these principles actually follow on really systematically, actually, but it's of encouragement. How do we, so we've spoken about equality, okay, as one of the principles, and creating that, and then creating the right type of environment of ease. We now want to encourage people to share their ideas, right? So as much as we can create equality by saying, So Shin, would you like to add something to the conversation, or however the chair of the meeting, or whatever the case may be, however they may phrase it. How do we sort of put encouragement on the table without sort of engaging in internal competition, if that makes sense? Because now we've created this environment, right, of giving attention, create equality, offering acknowledgement. do you feel in your experience, right, of practicing these principles, it ever leads to a situation where there's sort of this competition that is now put on the table, that I feel like I have to contribute, I have to think on the same level as my peers? Yeah, I don't know if that sort of makes sense, but how do we offer that encouragement? Again, I think it comes back to like the whole idea of putting pressure, and because we don't want, if I think of a social setting, to make it a bit more clearer for myself and hopefully for you as well. I've been in situations where you're with a group of friends and, we may be conversing about whatever, let's say holidays or something that happened, and we feel this need to one up the other person, right? So that doesn't encourage me now to share. If I'm in that circle, I don't want to share because I know you're gonna just try to one up me, and maybe I don't have a story that's up there with yours. Now I feel like, okay, I don't need to share, and that stops everything.
Sure, you've said it so beautifully. That is essentially our definition of encouragement. How do we move beyond this need to compete? So the idea here is that if I want to give you the courage to say it's okay to think for yourself, in fact, I'm interested in where you will go next with your thinking, right? And if I want to give you the courage to go to that cutting edge of your thinking, maybe it's a place that has never yet felt safe for you to go to, or maybe it's just never been enabled. Maybe nobody's ever asked you, what do you think about this issue, this situation? If I want to give you the courage to go there, I can't at the same time have the need to show you how smart I am, right? So if as a teacher, as a leader, as a parent, as somebody who wants to give courage to somebody else to access their best thinking, we have to quieten down the voice that says, I need to show you how smart I am, right? Or maybe even we might need to unpack that assumption. What about me, is making me feel that I need to show you, I need to do this one-up thing, right? And this is the level of awareness that I'm starting to allude to, is that if you want to be a thinking environment, then your need to prove your intelligence naturally and obviously becomes far less important than your being in such a way that is allowing and actually igniting thinking in the next person. So you could almost think about it as completely contradictory and conflicting objectives. If as a parent, I want to be telling my son how good I am at solving this maths problem or whatever it is a completely conflicting objective to me wanting to ask him how would he solve this problem, right? Because that second objective is one where I want to give him the courage to say, whatever you think now is going to be seen, it's going to be valuable to me, and it's going to be interesting to me.
I think it's such an interesting perspective, and I know you brought a book here with you, and I just started reading it yesterday, and I'll let you share the title and your thoughts on it, but I think it also comes back to this awareness that you speak of. And maybe before we touch on that book and some of that, I have to ask you the question, whose responsibility, right? Because it might be an obvious question, but you've spoken about just the first 5 principles today, and we'll cover the next 5 in the second episode. But I have to ask the question, whose responsibility is it to create this environment that we're working towards? And I don't think it's only applicable to the boardroom setting, if I can call it that. It comes back to relationships, parenting, like you just mentioned as well. Whose responsibility is it to almost enable these principles? And if I have to give an example, just because we've largely spoken about the boardroom setting, but feel free to extend it, right, to other settings. I have now listened to this episode on just the first 5 principles. I am not in a position to chair the meeting, but I'm aware of these principles now. How do I sort of, raise awareness about them in the meeting without compromising other people, in a sense that they might feel like, you don't know what you're doing about, I'm much more senior than you, I've been doing this much longer. That way doesn't sound like the best way. Or you might end up in a situation, if we quickly run back, we're in a setting, I now know about just these 5 principles, but the other people in this group do not. How do I then sort of raise awareness about these principles, if that makes sense?
It's a great question and a very difficult one as well. I think, in my experience, many people are not aware of what their behavior is doing for another person or for the environment of a meeting. So coming back to the responsibility question, you have a responsibility to create a thinking environment whenever you want for yourself people to do their best thinking. So that then it leads us to, when would we not want that, right? But now, coming to your nuanced question about what if you're in a setting where perhaps you're not the chair of the meeting, or you're not in control over how the discussion can get moderated, but you have a sense that somebody's views are really being trampled on, or that we're not even hearing from somebody else. So yeah, it's a deep question, and I don't want to do a disservice to, whose responsibility is it. I think it would all come down to what responsibility means in that setting. So I think, for example, for myself, it might be a case of, well, if I'm seeing an environment where it is unequal, where somebody's views are not getting heard, I suppose I have the responsibility to myself to ask myself, what do I want to do about it? And that could lead me to a whole bunch of solutions. It might even lead me to not addressing anything immediately, but going and asking about it afterwards. I could, for example, ask the person who I felt was not being heard, how did that meeting feel for you? I noticed that it wasn't an environment that really enabled you to express yourself as much as others. That might lead me to, get some ideas on, could I help in any way? Or if it's a choice that I want to make to empower the chair of the meeting to say, look, you may not be aware of this, but the way the meeting was run is actually more conducive to some people's thinking than to others. And I would argue that it's probably not conducive to anyone's thinking to be in an environment that is characterized by this level of domination and inequality anyway. Because even the ones who are the ones speaking, surely their thinking can't be as good as if it was in an environment where we had made this promise that we could all genuinely disagree and build on each other's ideas. So it's even a disservice to the let's say the extroverts in the room. So yes, I don't know the answer to whose responsibility it is, but I think what is useful for us to ask is, what responsibility do we have to ourselves in terms of what we want to achieve?
I think that's spot on, and it sort of sums up a lot about what a lot of what we've spoken about. You don't always have control over your environment. You don't always have control over the other person and how they are thinking and responding and all of that, but you do have control over yourself and the environment you create for yourself, and even the boundaries you set for yourself. And I think I'm really grateful that you've shared so many practical ways in which these can be implemented. So thank you for that and sharing your insights. I've really enjoyed it. And before we wrap this up, right, because I mentioned the book that you've brought, so I want to give you the spotlight to talk about it because I've just started reading it. Maybe share what the title of the book and how it ties into this concept and the principles we've spoken about.
Great, thanks. So the book we were chatting about is called What Happened to You, and it's written by Oprah and a very well-known psychiatrist and well-known in trauma circles, Dr. Bruce Perry. So he's been researching for quite a few decades what trauma actually does to our brains and how kind of that impacts our ability to respond to the environment. So it's and I think the subtext is something like conversations about trauma, resilience, and healing. And so the kind of analogy for me, and I'm just starting to think about this, so I don't yet have necessarily fully formulated ideas or thoughts yet, but I'm thinking about how context of trauma, like in South Africa, we have a system of inequality. We have systemic racism that is ubiquitous in our lives, and yet it's not really something that's addressed. And so I'm becoming more and more aware of how sensitized we are. So all the little instances as we're growing up of the ways in which these things impact our lives, whether it's the way we've seen our parents treating somebody of a different race group in the context of South Africa, whether it's my son seeing the difference between our circle versus the person who's begging on the street, that level of inequality, what is it doing to the formation of our brains, to the biology of our brains? And therefore, what are we learning from this context and this environment? And therefore, as a result of that, how will we behave to people who are different to us, right? So it's all this kind of othering that's going on that is making us view the other as unsafe. And that's kind of what I'm starting to think about. And a thinking environment at its core is trying to behave. It's trying to, it requires us to behave in a way that actually treats people as equals, because there's this underlying philosophical choice that no matter our circumstances, no matter our backgrounds, no matter even our knowledge of a certain subject, we are equal as thinkers. And so I'm interested in this context of trauma and inequality and what it does to this component of equality in a thinking environment. So that's, yeah.
No, I think that's brilliant. I don't want to put this on air, but maybe we could at some point do like an episode on it, on this link between trauma and the thinking environment and equality and inequality, like you're talking about. And the reason why I asked you just to mention the book and what you're working towards essentially and your curiosity at the moment, because it's a really fascinating book, and it comes back again to, and it's just a thought I had when you were talking, is these different traumas, if you want to call it that, or experiences, and the way that shapes our brains and the thoughts we have. And now we bring that to the environments we step into, whether it's the boardroom, the lecture room, relationships, parenting. So I think it would be a really fascinating conversation to have. So maybe at some point we can pencil that in and chat about that. So Shan, this was so insightful for me personally, and I'm sure everyone listening in has found lots of use in it. So thank you for sharing your insights and giving us your perspective on this one.
Yeah, thank you. It's been really great to be in this environment and to think about this beautiful and important topic.
Awesome. I look forward to part 2 and covering the rest of the principles. Thank you.
Thanks.